Migration is a key concept in the study of world history. So let's take a closer look. First of all, it's always a good idea to start with a definition. Migration is the movement of people from one place to another, usually across a political boundary, for the purpose of taking up either permanent or semi-permanent residence. Now, semi-permanent residence would be things like seasonal movements of migrant farm workers. People either choose to move or they're forced to move. So if they choose to, it's voluntary migration. If they're forced to, it's involuntary. Migration occurs at three main scales, and these are important to remember. First of all, there's intercontinental. That's when you move between continents. Intracontinental is between countries on a single continent. Now be careful not to mix those two up because they do look very similar. Finally, there's interregional, and that's simply moving within the same country. One of the most significant migration patterns to be aware of is that of going from rural to urban. That could be things like people moving from the countryside to cities for better employment. There are 10 main types of migration that you need to remember. Now, many of these can overlap, so don't get confused. First of all, there's internal migration. This just means moving to a new home within the same state, country, or continent. The opposite would be an external migration, moving to a new home in a different state, country, or continent. But notice, you could actually do both in the same migration. Let's say, for example, that I move from the United States to Canada. Technically, this is an external migration because it's a different country, but at the same time, it's within the same continent, so it is also internal. Emigration is when you leave one country to move to another. The other end of this journey would be referred to as immigration. That's when you move into the new country. These two are very commonly mistaken for one another, so make sure that you study them carefully. A population transfer is when the government forces a large group of people out of a region. Usually, this is based on ethnicity or religion. It might also be based on political belief. It can also be called an involuntary or a forced migration. An impelled migration is when individuals are not actually forced out of their country, but they leave anyway because of unfavorable situations. Impelled migrations can happen because of things like warfare, political problems, religious persecution, even environmental factors. It's also called a reluctant or an imposed migration. But make sure that you don't mix it up with a population transfer because they are different. A step migration is when you take a series of shorter, less extreme migrations from a place of origin to a final destination. So an example of a step migration might be a young man moving from a farm to a village, to a town, and finally to a city. Perhaps after that he moves to a new country. Notice how his migration was in steps, and they weren't very extreme until the end. A chain migration is a series of migrations within a family or a defined group of people. Now this usually begins, for example, with one family member who moves to a new home, works, and then sends money to bring the other family members into the same new location. When chain migrations happen, they result in what's called migration fields. Migration fields are the clustering of people from one specific region into certain neighborhoods or small towns. This is very common in the United States, a country which was made up of immigrants. A return migration is also known as a circular migration. It's the voluntary movements of immigrants back to their place of origin. And lastly, a seasonal migration, which is the process of moving for a period of time in response to labor or climate conditions. So, for example, migrant farm workers do seasonal migrations. Now, historians use different terms for different people who migrate, and these are very good to know as well. First of all, an emigrant is a person who's leaving one country to reside in another. Easily mixed up with it is an immigrant. An immigrant is entering a country from another to take up new residence. A little trick. The "im" in immigrant sounds very similar to "in." So you can remember immigrant by saying he goes into a new country, therefore he's an immigrant. A refugee is a person who's residing outside the country of his or her home due to persecution. Now, this is typically reasons of race, religion, nationality. It might be membership in a particular social group, could be political opinion. There's lots of reasons why a person becomes a refugee. For example, perhaps you have a Christian who has to leave Saudi Arabia and goes to Australia. Another type of person who migrates is an internally displaced person, or an IDP. An IDP is forced to leave his or her home region because of unfavorable conditions, and there's a variety of them. Environmental is very common, but so are political issues, war, etc. But this person does not cross any boundaries. They stay within their same country. Now be careful, because IDP is not the same as refugee, although they're easy to mix up for students. A refugee leaves their country. An IDP stays in their country. When you have a group migration, this is called a migration stream. So you have a group of people from a particular country, region, or city, and they move to the same particular destination. An example of this might be the groups of Germans who came over to the United States and settled in the city of Cincinnati. Most of the people who came over initially were actually from some of the same cities in Germany. Understanding why people migrate is a key part of understanding world history. Now, there are two main factors for why people migrate. First of all, there are push factors. These are the reasons why a person leaves. So examples might be a food shortage, war, environmental factors, unemployment. The other are called pull factors. This is why you immigrate into a new place. It's because there's something desirable. It could be a nicer climate, better food supply, religious or political freedom. Maybe it's because your family has already gone there. One of the interesting things about migration is that it tends to follow certain laws. Now notice these are in quotes because they're not set in stone. It's just that they're very commonly observed. The first law of migration is that most migrants only travel a short distance. International migrations, until recently, really weren't that common. Migrants who travel a long distance usually settle in an urban area. Most migrations occur in steppes. And most migration is rural to urban rather than urban to rural. When you have migration flows, they produce a movement in the opposite direction known as a counterflow. So basically, when a group of people move into a new place, usually a group of people from that same place will move out. An example of this might be when Europeans came over to the present-day United States. many of the indigenous people left the areas when new people came in. Now notice, this is not necessarily a good thing. It's just something that happens. Additionally, most migrants are adults. And, very interestingly, most international migrants tend to be young males, whereas it's more common for internal migrants to be female. It's very important to understand the impact that migration has. Now, the biggest impact of migration is what we call diffusion. Diffusion is the process through which certain characteristics, like character traits, ideas, disease, language, spread over space and through time. There are two main types of diffusion for you to understand. Relocation diffusion is where ideas, cultural traits, etc. move with people and don't remain at the point of origin. So here's a little example. You notice that we have these acorns. They're at the point of origin. Our little chipmunk comes and he takes them with him. They leave the point of origin and they go to the new location. That's relocation diffusion. Expansion diffusion is when ideas, cultural traits, etc. actually move with people from one place to another, but at the same time are not lost at the point of origin. A very common example of this is language. So in our little example, our squirrel comes, he takes an acorn, but he also leaves one behind. Now notice that our little squirrel also left a little bit of himself behind, a bit of his history, you might say. That is an example of cultural markers. Cultural markers are structures or artifacts, might be things like buildings, spiritual places, architectural styles, signs, etc., that reflect the cultures and histories of those people who constructed or occupy them. Cultural markers, in short, are the bread and butter of historians. Now, hopefully, after viewing this, you have a better understanding of migration.